Well, hello everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Welcome to the latest of the Islands Matter webinars, which are in origin due to a collaboration between myself and Professor Frank Rennie from UHI Outer Hebrides and Beth Mowat from UHI Shetland. We had this idea a long time ago about developing a series of webinars that would explore the research that's being undertaken within the UHI about islands, but also have the opportunity to bring in people who are researching islands sort of out with Scotland that people would like to hear. And we've had a series of really fascinating seminars on all sorts of topics. As you can see from our webpage at the Islands Matter one, which can be explored via the Institute of Northern Studies. Lots of great stuff there to delve into. And we're going to have another excellent seminar today, because I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Bobby Macaulay, from Unst, who doesn't live in Unst any longer, but works in UHI Perth, but has kept a sort of a beady eye on island research from his mainland fastness, as it were. Bobby is the co-lead on the Scottish Islands Research Network, which has done some really interesting work about how research should be undertaken in islands, and he's on the executive committee of the International Small Islands Studies Association as well, which connects island communities around the world. So I'm very pleased to have Bobby here today, and he's going to take a more sort of, I don't know, philosophical approach to island matters by reflecting on being now a mainland-based island studies scholar, but still focusing his interest on islands, or in islands. There's one of these perennial questions that we could probably shouldn't get into. So with that, Bobby, it's great to see you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Great to be able to speak at this today. And yeah, there's a few faces and names that I remember and recognise there. So I'll maybe just dive straight in. Andrew, I have no idea how long I'm meant to be speaking for or how long this will take. So if you just shout at me if I'm going wildly over time, then I'll speed it up a bit.
It's absolutely fine, Bobby. We have an hour, and sometimes we take longer. Depends on the topic and the discussions that come from it. So, the hour is yours. You can feel free to talk as much as you want, or engage in conversation, discussion with people. Entirely up to you. And there's no time restraints. And also, folk, if you have questions for Bobby, you can put them in the chat, and I can pass them on to him after he's finished his presentation. I think I can also make people sort of into presenters themselves. I think I have that ability, so I might even be able to put you on the screen to ask the questions personally. So there we go.
Great. Just now. Can you just let me know that that's all up in presenter mode?
It certainly is. Nice and clear.
Excellent. Thanks very much for having me here. What I'm going to present is perhaps not a philosophical, but more a kind of semi-autobiographical view of my kind of experience with island studies. And yeah, coming from an island, but living on a mainland, on the mainland of Scotland, of the UK, for some time now. I chose the term remote working on purpose. As an island scholar not living on an island, you are remote from your subject. I am the remote one. I am away from the islands in which I study. And so I find that when I am studying islands, looking at islands, then I am in a state of remoteness from my subject. And it's all fine and good being able to do that online these days. But it's just remembering that remoteness is just being far away from something that's important. And in this case, living in Glasgow, I am. So I'm going to speak about kind of my experiences and thoughts with interspersing a little bit of theory from island studies in here and reflect on that for the next wee while. Many of you on this call are aware of kind of the basics of island studies, looking at the term nessology, looking at islands on their own terms, and giving voice and platform for the expression of island narratives. So even in this second quote here, it makes it clear that island studies is not necessarily by islanders, or even necessarily with or for them, but of them. So it is, maybe this is getting into the philosophy, it's considering islands on their own terms, the research of the places. But very explicitly there, this paper from Baldacchino says that you do not have to be an islander to conduct island studies. But I'm going to dig into this a little bit more using my own experiences, and I will pose more questions than answers in this. So, as much as there might be questions coming in the chat, I suppose this is a piece that's trying to kind of elicit some responses from other island students, island scholars, but also to reflect on our positionality, where we stand, how we interpret things, whether we are from islands or not. So just a little bit about me, because as this will be very much a reflexive piece and looking at positionality, I think it's important to kind of state my background. I was born in Unst. I'll show maps in the next slide, so you'll get an idea of the positions of some of these places. My parents were incomers. They moved to Unst just shortly before I was born. I was born in Shetland, lived in Unst until I was 16, and since then only returned for holidays. It's almost exactly 20 years since I left home. In those 20 years, I lived for 4 years in Southern Africa and 15 years over 2 periods in Glasgow. I've worked at the University of the Highlands and Islands for almost 4 years now. I live in Glasgow and I commute to Perth 2 days a week. So a bit of a provocative question at the bottom there is, am I an islander? But we'll move on from that just now. As I say, some maps just to give you some context. This is Scotland. That is Shetland up in the top right-hand corner. This is the Western Isles. I'm going to speak a little bit about research in the Western Isles later. So just to give you an idea of the location and distance there. That is Glasgow. That's where I live currently. And that is Perth. That's where I work. So my commute a couple of days a week is between those two cities, one big city, one small city on the mainland of Scotland. Zooming into Shetland itself, this is, Shetland, and this is Unst at the top there. So that's where I spent the first 16 years of my life. Currently, I live here. This is the building I live in. This is my flat. So I'm a long way from home, both geographically and I suppose existentially, in a sense. This is my flat in Glasgow. So what kind of brought me home to islands was very much research and my research work. So I wrote my master's at UHI and focused in sustainable rural development and focused my dissertation on Shetland in 2015. My PhD focused on Uist and the Western Isles. I have since done project work in Eriskay and in Eigg, and recently a secondment in Cape Verde, which I'll speak about a little bit as well. But all of this research was conducted while I lived on the mainland of Scotland, and all of it was conducted over 10 years after I left Unst, after I left, after I left living on an island. And then in terms of my current roles, Andrew mentioned that I co-lead of the Scottish Islands Research Network and on the executive committee of the International Small Island Studies Association. My main research focus is on community organisations in rural and island settings, whether they be land or asset owning organisations or other organisations in rural and island contexts. And I'm currently writing a paper on sustainable development in mountainous islands. So very much, I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as solely an island scholar, but I do conduct a lot of research on islands, in islands, focusing on islands. So on that basis, if I sit at the bottom, am I an island scholar? From the basis of, I suppose, my CV and background, the answer may be yes. But again, it's perhaps something to reflect on. I'm going to pose 4 questions as part of this talk, focus on 4 main themes, and it's very much focusing on the importance of islandness in island studies. So there's a couple of things there. What is islandness? Do you have to be an islander? Do you have to have come from an island, live in an island? What is islandness? And then how that applies to island studies. So that's why I pose the questions about, am I an islander and am I an island scholar? So firstly, is it important that islanders conduct island studies? Is islandness and the study of islands affected by temporal or geographical distance, so time spent away from an island or geography from that island? Can islandness be attained? If so, how? What is the threshold for islandness? And does that islander status apply to different islands within the kind of area of island studies? So I'm going to reflect on these both by using a little bit of theory from island studies and also, I suppose, autobiographical case studies from my own work. So first, being born into island studies or an island scholar. So a couple of quotes here about the island becoming part of your being, a part as deep as marrow and as natural and unself-conscious as breathing. So islandness is something that you are born into and is a natural part of you. Islanders know about islandness, and all of us should have some of this imprinted on our consciousness. So this is saying that people from islands have something very special, something that is imprinted on them from birth, which I suppose distinguishes them from others, perhaps non-islanders. And this ability of islanders, therefore, surely gives them the ability to study islands on their own terms, because there is islandness within you. And so you can therefore use that to study islands on their own terms. And I suppose on that basis, should island research be conducted solely or predominantly by native islanders, or is there something about, I put the term in inverted commas, native islanders, which makes research better or different? I'll just put up a photo here of contrasting this to my flat in Glasgow. This is the house that I grew up in Unst, and gives a very different view of the world to that tenement flat in Glasgow. I want to reflect on this question in terms of my master's dissertation research, which I conducted in Shetland. I was looking at the role of social enterprise in improving health in Shetland. So this was in 2015. It had already been 10 years since I'd left Shetland. But I still knew a lot of people there. I knew a lot about the place. A lot of people knew my parents and my siblings, and that affected both the way that I went into data collection and the data that I received. So I I was speaking to people and asking them questions as a researcher, and they knew that I knew the answer. They knew that the questions I was asking them had an objective answer that I knew, but I needed to adopt that researcher, persona and approach to say, no, I need you to tell me. And they said, oh, well, it's just, how it is. But I needed them to tell me for the purposes of the tape. And so people were almost holding back from giving me what they considered almost too simplistic information and simplistic data because I already knew it. They were not telling this researcher something new. They were just having to repeat what they considered common knowledge for the purposes of the data that was required by me. And so what I found was that some of the questions I was asking, I didn't get a direct response to because they were just obvious questions. I needed them for my studies, but folk knew that they weren't actually the more important questions there. So there's elements of data collection which was affected by the fact that folk knew me and they knew where I was from and what background I was from. And then that reflexivity and positionality. So I needed to almost adopt this insider-outsider approach of saying, I cannot then extrapolate those answers to mean anything. I have to attempt to adopt an objective stance when there is nothing objective about this. When you do an interview and then after the interview, folks say, oh, how's your mum? Oh, yeah, I used to work with your dad. This kind of thing, it affects how you go about your work as a researcher. And some people are really good at doing that. Some people can very much tread that line between between researcher and non-researcher and be able to conduct research in their own communities and with people they know. I found that very difficult because in collecting the data, there's aspects and dynamics there which made it difficult to do from a research perspective. And also in analyzing the data, there were areas where I kind of knew what people were saying, but I couldn't interpret that because that's not what you should do. So I found that positionality in my own interpretation and analysis very difficult to manage. And I said after that I would never again conduct research in Shetland because as someone who knew that community and those people, I found it actually more difficult. So the questions I've posed there, was this research better or worse because of my own islandness? And I'd go further in to say because of my own Shetlandness. Did actually I gather worse data or not as robust data because I was that insider to an extent? Now, there's also outsider dynamics there because I'd lived away for 10 years, because I don't speak the Shetland dialect. So there's a linguistic divide there. And because my parents were incomers. So there's an element there where insider-outsider is far more complex as well, because even if I'd stayed in Shetland, there would be an insider-outsider dynamic. So what I would say is my own answer to should all research be conducted by so-called native islanders is no. And also I would suggest that they are not always the best people to conduct that research because it can affect data. Saying that, there are fairly well-kent faces and voices in Scotland suggesting that all research in islands should be conducted by local islanders. And so I just wanted to slightly problematize that and suggest that that may be beneficial in some cases, but it may also not be possible or actually be detrimental to the research in other cases. I'll move on then to the second of my questions and consider how islandness in one sense can be affected in other times and places. So there's a couple of lovely quotes here. Wherever an islander may travel, he remains an islander. He speaks of his home as the island without explanation or qualification, and he uses the term as if less to describe a body of land surrounded by water than a state of life. So if you are an islander, you are always an islander throughout your life. You never lose it. You never lose this islandness. Islandness lives in one's mind and imagination, and therefore can be carried within one no matter where one might be. So these two quotes say you always have it, you don't lose it throughout your life, and also you carry it with you to other islands as well. And this is interesting because is it possible to then take this, whatever this ephemeral islandness is, and apply it to other islands? And does it work in the same way? The first time I met Andrew in person was in Croatia, and he asked me about my background and my research, and I told him, and he said, "You are an island scholar," because despite being from a variety of, having lived in different places and studied different islands, you bring that islandness with you to your research. And I took that as a great compliment. But it is an interesting concept that can that be retained and applied? So I suppose to investigate this a little bit more, I'll use the case study of my PhD research, which was conducted in the Western Isles. In Uist, so I suppose they're considered the Southern Isles of the Western Isles. It's a string of islands, all of which have around about 1,000-ish folk between North Uist, Benbecula, South Uist, 1,000, 1,500 folk on each island. A lot of similarities in some ways to the Northern Isles of Shetland, where I grew up, in terms of some elements of culture, music and dancing are similar. Crofting culture, so small scale agriculture, kind of dominates a lot of the land. There were elements there which were very similar, and so there was, I suppose, a tendency or a possibility of then saying, "Oh, I know this place. I'm an islander in the same country, in a similar size of island. I know what this place is about." But there's also huge differences. If you've ever been to the North Isles of Shetland and the South Isles of the Western Isles, they are fundamentally different in many ways as well. There's an entire religious dynamic in the Western Isles, where at the north end of the Western Isles there are quite strict Presbyterian, I suppose, history, and to an extent current contemporary culture. Whereas at the southern end, there is the highest percentage of Roman Catholics anywhere in the UK. So there's a religious sectarian dynamic there that doesn't exist in Shetland. Also, in the Western Isles, Gaelic is spoken, the old Scottish language. There is no Gaelic spoken in Shetland at all. So there's massive differences there as well. That islandness, that assumption that I might know certain elements of this culture, had to just be checked a little bit to say, how much do I know? Even though on the face of it, this is a similar looking island, similar population, similar industries, similar challenges, similar distance from the Scottish mainland, there are also massive differences there. And so islandness could not be assumed to then be, I suppose, a distinguishing factor there in being able to study these islands. What I did find was field work and data collection was very much eased, partly I got to know folk, and the culture of folk, the way of folk was similar. They were, for the most part, friendly and doer, and just a way that I know folk to be, and I felt quite comfortable in that situation because I kind of knew that type of people. If that doesn't sound too sweeping and generalizing. So I found it quite easy to speak to folk and get involved in things. So I was going and heading to the pub and playing football and doing these things where I felt like I was known within that setting for more than just research, and I was bringing something of myself to it rather than just being a completely external researcher. Socially, I was able to make some inroads due to, I would say, my knowledge of that islandness, that island culture. And also methodological techniques. I started doing this accidentally, but at the start of every interview in Uist, I said, I'm actually from Shetland originally. And I did it accidentally at first, but then I used it as a technique because that was almost asserting my own islandness in that setting. And what the result of it was that people felt that they could skip the first 20 minutes of explaining the basics of how you live in islands or what it's like to be here. There was a recognition that I knew bits and pieces about what it was like when the ferries break down and what a crofting community looks like, and just dynamics within the community that didn't need to be explained to me because I kind of got it. Whereas if it was a different person from Glasgow, from the mainland, who'd never been to an island community before, there might have been a lot more kind of initial explanation of that. Now, similar to in Shetland, does that mean that I missed out on data that might have been pertinent to my study? But I think in this sense, I saw it as the opposite. I saw it as we could really get into the meaty stuff and the important stuff because we could skip all of the fluff about what it's like to live here, and we could get into actually what I was looking at. So that islandness and that assertion of my own background was a helpful, useful aspect there, even though it was an island other than my own. As I say, very much taking care and acknowledging my positionality and analytical assumptions made. So when I was analyzing data, all qualitative analysis is subjective in some way. You cannot conduct completely objective qualitative analysis. Therefore, you bring something of yourself into analyzing that data. And I needed to be very careful about how much of myself and whether I was interpreting data through a Shetland lens, or whether I was able to consider that in terms of the island on its own terms, to take that phrase again. And so that was just something to reflect on for me, is recognizing there may be similarities here, there are also differences here, and regardless, when I am analyzing this data, I am a professional researcher, not someone from Shetland, not someone who visited Uist. I'm here to try and interpret what this is. And so in that sense, the question, did islander status make this research better? I would perhaps suggest yes. But there was a lot of reflection in terms of that and just considering what I brought to it and what the impact of that was. In terms of that community integration, I was found a particularly helpful fieldwork technique was to be able to play football. That's me there, playing left back for Erisk AFC. As I say, it's just about, I suppose, showing that you're a real person and not just a researcher. That's not too insulting. So moving on. Incomers and islandness. Can incomers have islandness, and can incomers be island scholars? really interesting quote here from Karen Jackson. I feel sometimes as if my place is at the back of the line, behind a long list of people who have come before us. Sometimes there seems to be no end to the dues that must be paid before the initiation into simply belonging. So when you come into an island community, what do you need to do to be part of that community? On the other side, Conkling here, islandness can also be ingested by newcomers who first consciously and then unconsciously incorporate local customs, wisdom, and appreciation for island institutions into their view of the world. Now, for those of us who have lived on islands or come from islands, I'm sure we can think of incomers who have incorporated local customs, wisdoms, and appreciation for island institutions, and those who have not. And they are very distinct groups, and they very much are, I suppose, that will be rewarded or punished by local people. You get folk who come in and want to change everything. You get folk who come in and don't get involved in anything. You get folk who come in and want to shout a lot but don't really know what to do. But then you get people who come in, appreciate what the island culture is, may be able to contribute to it, may be able to suggest some new ways, but ultimately live within the culture that is there. And I think that can be the difference between incomers achieving islandness, incomers and islandness or not. I wanted to include this slide because I was reading a book and I just found some of these examples and I found them fascinating. So just some terms for non-islanders. I assume incomer is a fairly common one. Blow-in, I think this might be a Scottish term. Maybe it's used elsewhere. I don't know if it's used throughout Scotland. But yeah, you get blow-ins. You get blow-ins that stay for a year, blow-ins that stay for 5 years. Some people have been living in island communities for 20 years and they're still considered blow-ins. In Canada, come from away is apparently so common an expression that it's just commonly shortened to CFAs. Oh yeah, that's just a group of CFAs. Wash ashore in the US. Yeah, it's similar to blow-in, as if a storm has brought them in. Ferry looper, I'd never heard from Orkney, but I assume coming on the ferry. Soothmoother from Shetland. Now, I always considered this to be a linguistic thing. So that's south mouther. Your mouth makes sounds like you're from the south. So you talk in a way like people from the mainland do. So it's a linguistic distinction of an incomer. However, somebody, and Andrew can maybe fill me in about this, someone suggested that actually that Lerwick is the capital of Shetland. There are two entrances into Lerwick Harbour, the North Mouth and the South Mouth. And there was a suggestion that actually the term Soothmoother refers to people who have come into the harbour on boats through the Soothmouth. Is that right, Andrew? Excellent. Then, so rather than being a linguistic distinction, it is actually an indication of the arrival method of those people into Shetland. Anyway, moving on. Whale wielder in Cyprus is a great one because people from the Greek mainland that came over tended to be teachers. So anyone that came in from Greece was wielding a quill, and that became the term for incomers. And the most brutal one I found was non-belonger in the British Virgin Islands. It's not just that you have arrived, you don't belong. You may be here, but you don't belong here. And this term is written into the law and constitution because non-belongers are not allowed to own property and there's various other rights they don't have. And so this idea that you don't belong here I think is absolutely brutal for folk who have moved to the British Virgin Islands. Far rather be a soothmouther than a non-belonger. And as we may well know, these often apply to the next generation. So I don't speak the Shetland dialect. I was born to incomers, and so there will be some that consider me an incomer into Shetland, some that don't. But generations can go by of people who are not considered, I suppose, local or native or an islander. So moving on to island incomers to island studies. Islandness is a sense that is absorbed by islanders through the obstinate and tenacious hold of island communities, but visitors can also experience the sensation as an instantaneous recognition. So there's a suggestion here that incomers can also, I suppose, achieve or attain islandness and can see things from an island perspective. And then specifically around island studies, Baldacchino here, outsiders then, spared from being party to the divisions and personal animosities of their looked-at subset, could provide valid and insightful commentaries on island life. So, in this sense, outsiders can conduct research in a different way, a potentially beneficial way, to people from that island. Outsiders, whether they are islanders but outsiders or non-islanders, they can come and the fact that they are different, the fact that they are not islanders or local islanders, can be considered beneficial. To this point, I'll mention a study that I conducted this year in an island called Eigg. Eigg wanted to do a community survey. Eigg is a fascinating island. They bought the land that they live on. Eigg is community owned. They also have an awful lot of Viking interest and things that are in the ground that need dug up. And so there's a lot of researchers that go to Eigg. And despite all of these research requests, all these researchers never once had the local people been asked what they wanted to find out, if they had any research needs. So someone from Eigg came to me and said, we want to do a survey celebrating 27 years since the community purchase of the island. So I undertook this study, and basically the idea was that we would co-design a comprehensive, multifaceted community survey, and I would undertake it and write it up. So Eigg has about 120 people. I've said the usual tensions in small island communities. I should have maybe also said the usual connectedness and solidarity and help and all that kind of thing as in island communities as well, because in some ways there may be two sides of the same coin. There were the odd tensions, but there's also, it's a very I suppose solid and helpful community as well. But because of these tensions, because it's quite a small population, there was a desire for an so-called objective outsider to conduct and report this research. So even though there was community collaboration in the design of the survey, because they wanted to know certain types of information. So it was initially designed by the community trust, the local organization, but then every resident was invited to add questions, delete questions, reword them, include things, just because you don't know what you don't know. And it's only with this idea of having more information about your community that you can then take actions. And as a community-owned island with a very strong organization, they could take actions. They can set priorities based on the findings of the research. So the results, I conducted the research and the results were fed back to the community, partly so that they can reflect on their own situation, demographics, needs, and understand what's going on within their own community, but also then set priorities for the next objectives for the communities, for the community on their own terms. So it's through that knowledge that they received, and I suppose hopefully their trust that that research was conducted in a robust way, and that I didn't have any agenda in terms of being able to report any particular things, that that they were able to do that. So I would suggest that this research was benefited through being an outsider from the island. I don't think it would have been possible in the same way being an island resident. But I suppose I pose that question there, did it need to be an island scholar? And how would it have been different if it was someone who had no background in islands research at all? Would that make it even more objective, I suppose, in a sense? Or would they not have been able to design the survey in the same way due to not having that basic information? It's not a very inspiring photo there, but this was our discussion sessions for designing the survey in the Eigg Community Hall. And we got what I considered a really good response rate, over 50% of the adult population responding. And so we delivered that research report back to Eigg just a couple of months ago. Finally, the last question that I posed here was, to what extent can islandness be applied in very different island situations? So, according to these quotes here, islanders from different archipelagos share a sense of islandness that transcends the particulars of local island culture. The result is something we define as islandness. So islandness can be gained in one island, but then applied to a completely other island setting, and you will still know that through your islandness what's going on in that other setting. Islanders share a common sense with other islanders worldwide in much the same way that scientists share a common sense worldwide on such things as denotation, logic, control, and proof. So we are connected, all of us islanders. And so I can be transplanted into any other island, and my islandness and island studies knowledge will allow me to conduct research there. Well, let's put that to the test. Recently, I was in Cape Verde, which is an archipelago off the west coast of Africa, as part of an incredible project funded by Horizon Europe, which was looking at sustainable development initiatives in highland regions, so in mountainous regions around the world. And there's a series of individual and group secondments in different highland regions. So you go with a group of other people and conduct interviews and discuss these initiatives in sustainable development in highland regions in order to create a big database of all of these different initiatives around the world, so that we can start to cut that data in different ways and look at how different initiatives are done, and is there connections between these initiatives around the world. Now, this particular session was called Highlands on Islands. So it was looking at sustainable development initiatives in highland regions, in mountainous regions, but in this sense, mountainous region on an island. And so methodologically, the focus was on highlandness, not islandness, but it was all conducted within this island setting. Another map there, that is Cape Verde, just to give you an idea of where we're looking at. So just off the coast of West Africa, closest mainland country is Senegal. Former Portuguese colony, official language is Portuguese, but most people speak a form of Creole that is between French and Portuguese and various other influences. This is the different islands of Cape Verde. I was based on the kind of bottom in the middle where it says Praia. That is the island of Santiago. and then the team took a ferry to the island just on the left of that, where it says Sao Felipe. That island's called Fogo, and that was a 4.5 hour ferry between those two. So that's the kind of distances we're speaking about there, just between those two fairly close islands, not considering all those other ones, which essentially would require crossing of open ocean to get to. So quite disparate island grouping there. I suppose this kind of challenged this universal islander assumption, because I, up until this point, I'd conducted all of my research in Scottish islands. So everyone spoke English, even if it wasn't their first language. I kind of got the law and the culture and the what was going on there. But this is an island nation in Africa where there were significant cultural and linguistic differences. So this concept that I could understand them as an islander was really put to the test. There was a racial colonial dynamic there. Cape Verde didn't have an indigenous population, so to speak. Everyone who lived there was brought from the mainland of Africa by the Portuguese. There's a significant history of slavery. And having a group of 20 predominantly white, predominantly European academics descending and asking people questions was quite a challenging dynamic in many senses. And despite, that there are so many differences, cultural, linguistic, historical, everything, to what extent could I really rely on islandness and say, well, not we're all the same, but I understand this place and this situation because we are islanders? And I found this quite challenging because there are so many other differences. Islandness is only one facet of someone's personality, surely. And if you share that one facet, but you differ in every other one, can you really hope to understand people and their situation, as this kind of assertion seems to suggest? But there were commonalities. Industry, on every island there will be a fishing industry. So there was fishing. There was something that I recognized as being islandy, which was boats going out fishing. There were community organizations, which is what I study within this island, which implied that there was some form of solidarity and community togetherness or participation beyond just kind of the state or the private sector. There was that element of boundedness and identity. People were from Cape Verde, and more accurately, people were from their individual islands in Cape Verde, and they had that identity. There was a lot of football shirts being worn around the place. The Cape Verde national team, that for me, that is a sign of people recognizing that they are part of a country, is when they support a national team, so there's identity with the country and identity as kind of that island nation. There are more people from Cape Verde that live outside of Cape Verde than inside. So migration is a massive element, out migration, especially of young people, to Portugal, to Brazil. Cape Verde is the closest African country to Brazil and to America. So there's massive Cape Verdean communities in Massachusetts, in the US. And so remittances are quite a big part of the economy. But that element of out-migration of young, skilled people is something that I can relate to and that I was a part of myself. And so there's an element there of saying, yeah, okay, I can kind of get my head around this. And then what I've put is culture of work and play. The tagline of Cape Verde, the kind of motto, is no stress. It says it on the national team's football shirts. I've never seen a football team playing with no stress. It says it on all of the, tourist tat and magnets and everything like that. No stress. And there is a trope about islands that they are lazy and all this kind of thing. It's not that. When I go back to Unst, it is the busiest I ever am. There's so much going on, there's so much to do. But people don't seem stressed, they just seem busy. And that maybe I'm extrapolating a wee bit too far, but that element of that culture of work and play, you work hard and then you play/relax hard, was something that I don't know, might need a little bit more research, but something that seemed to make sense to me as well. That it wasn't stress, it was just activity and it was hard work. And that seemed to resonate as well. So I'd suggest there that this is pushing the boundaries of islandness, but I don't think I could really assert whether or not this is kind of beyond that assumption that islandness can be transposed into a different location. This is a photo of us doing a group interview. But methodologically, I found it fascinating as well. I've never done group interviews before. It wasn't a focus group. It was everyone here is a researcher, apart from that man in the blue shirt at the back there. So it was like an inverted focus group. And I was leading this interview, and the guy in the red shirt, just to the right, was our interpreter. So it was doing an interview through an interpreter with this guy who was the chair of essentially a community development trust. Now, I have done many, many interviews with chairs of development trusts. And so there's an element there of me going, no, I kind of know what I'm doing here, but for all of those other reasons, linguistically, then the dynamics of race and the fact that we were in, I mean, you see the vegetation behind, this is not Shetland. So it really challenged my kind of understanding of whether islandness and island studies could really be transposed in that way. Anyway, I suppose that's most of my talk there. I have not really conclusions, more questions. I've attempted to kind of convey the complexity of my own experience of islandness and island studies. That inside or outsider dynamic is constant, as I say, even in Shetland for various reasons, but in the Western Isles and Scotland and in various different settings. And then for mainland-based island scholars, how does that dynamic work? If you cannot lose your islandness, but you fundamentally don't know the current lived experience, or you don't live that lived experience of the people that you're studying, is there something that you miss out on? Is there something that you can't necessarily replicate there? And then I suppose some questions for island scholars. Is islandness intrinsic, learnt, or studied? Do you just have it? Do you learn it from being in an island? Or can you study? Can you be a mainlander and always a mainlander, but study enough to know how to do island studies? Is it retained beyond the bounds of time and geography? Do you ever lose it? And can you transpose it to other places? And to what extent is it relevant and applicable in very different island contexts? And then I suppose finally and fundamentally, how do the answers to these questions affect our research? What are these reflections really doing? Are they important? What is the purpose of doing this? Because will it affect the way we ask questions, the way we interpret data, the way we speak to people? And how does islandness affect our island studies going forward? But I suppose, yeah, they're just, I think, important to reflect on when you're working in this field. And then finally, I'll just leave you with a photo of the next generation of island scholar there, who's that was his first time in Unst. and hopefully the first of many more. And so I suppose there's another question there of, if I may not be an island scholar or an islander, is my son born on the mainland, only visiting Shetland, ever possible to be an island scholar in the future? But that's not a question for right now. So with that, yeah, that's my email address there. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Bobby. That was, it was philosophical. Philosophical reflections on island research, methodology, identity, embeddedness, inside and outside. So much to think about. I seem to have frozen. Has everybody else frozen, or is it just me?
I can see you.
You can see.
Yeah, you're moving for me.
Yeah, that's fine. Could you hear what I said there?
Yeah, I could. Yeah.
Excellent. No, I mean, it's so much to think about, and that reflexive attitude towards research is so valuable. There's some wonderful questions, but also comments and reflections in turn in the chat. So I don't know if you have a chance just to have a look at those. There's questions about the nature of embeddedness and about how about identity as well, and also about the distance that can be useful if you're undertaking research in islands, to overcome that problem of being so embedded that everybody thinks you know the answer already. So while you're having a look at that, we do have some minutes for you to react to some of those comments. I'd just like to ask, how Shetland do you feel? Just a sort of basic question.
I mean, it's difficult because not particularly, but if I'm not from Shetland, then I'm not really from anywhere else, so I'm kind of homeless, Well,
a follow-on question from that: how does Unstness vary from Shetlandness? Is it Unst that is a particular draw?
Perhaps, yeah. And every island in any archipelago will be different in its culture. And Unst, I suppose, in some ways has had more of an influence